Deep in the woods of Monroe, Connecticut, the search for a lost cave is underway. In the 1880s, a large underground chamber and prehistoric artifacts were purportedly discovered. In the 1940s, the cave was visited by a noted cave explorer who found the entrance collapsed a short way inside, blocking his investigation. Finally, in the 1960s, the entrance was blown up by the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, efforts are being made to reopen this cave and bring its story back to light.
But we can already start to see that there's a sort of an archway.
It's hard to describe. It's opening up down there.
So we already got pretty far in, moved some huge boulders out of here, and I think we're onto something.
In the late 1800s, leisure and recreation were an important part of Victorian life. Summertime meant escape from the sweltering, acrid streets of New York City aboard a steam locomotive bound for nearby Connecticut. The vacationers would take to the hills and rivers, finely dressed, with a picnic basket in hand. Any and all points of interest were exploited for entertainment value, including limestone caves. In the 1870s, the Salisbury Cave in northern Connecticut was one of only 3 commercial tour caves in America. A mere 10 cents would buy entrance into the cave, oilcloth suit and candle included. And of course, in true Victorian fashion, a dance hall and bar were built just outside the cave entrance. A maze of water-carved tunnels led deep into a strange underground world. A world that few at that time had ever seen. The Salisbury Cave, later known as the Twin Lakes Cave, is to this day one of the largest known caves in New England. Because of this, one would assume the state of Connecticut is filled with limestone caves. But this is not the case. There are hundreds of jumbled rock caves and cliff overhangs, but surprisingly very few true limestone solution caves. And even these few are limited to the northwestern hills of the state. So naturally, when I was invited to help rediscover a lost limestone cave in Monroe, Connecticut, I jumped at the chance. A small but dedicated group was assembled by local historian Marvin Moss, including the landowner who also happened to own an excavator. At 10 o'clock, we arrived at the cave site. John, the landowner and operator of the excavator, maneuvered into position and began digging.
Pinpoint them to, you just delicately dig out where we think the entrance is on the farther side.
The cave had been a source of local legend for decades. About 1820, the cave was first mined for limestone, which was roasted in a kiln and sold locally as fertilizer. I found pieces of limestone strewn across the riverbank, likely mined from the cave at this time. This venture was soon given up when the lime turned out to be poor quality. For the next 50 years, it was seemingly forgotten. That is, until a local farmer named Henry Plumb came upon the cave and explored it to a distance of about 60 feet. He kept his find secret, and 2 years later bought the land containing the cave. According to a newspaper article dated 1886, Plumb hired workmen to dig out dirt that had accumulated in the entrance of the cave. A total of 3 openings were discovered. One large chamber, entered through an arched tunnel, was said to measure about 30 by 40 feet. The gigantic proportions of the cave and the discovery of prehistoric artifacts were touted by the newspaper. Plumb planned to make the cave into a tourist attraction called Wildwood. He built a trail from the railroad, and like the Salisbury cave, he constructed a pavilion for dancing. By the 1890s, its popularity faded until it was finally closed. In the 1930s, the cave saw a brief resurgence of interest, but was again soon closed and the entrances were filled in. I found the cave mentioned in a book called New England's Buried Treasure, written by the founder of the National Speleological Society, Clay Perry. He had heard of the large chamber deep in the cave, said to hold 75 people with stone seats and a table carved into the walls, and called the King's Ballroom. When he visited the cave in the 1940s, he had found it collapsed a short way inside, blocking his exploration and sealing off the King's Ballroom.
What do you think is in the King's Ballroom? In the King's Ballroom. God. In it. I'm imagining you could probably still see the seats in there. If there were seats in there. I'm imagining the dirt flooding in from the entrance, halfway through the ballroom, covering most of it, but there's still one corner where there's one seat barely visible still, and maybe a couple initials carved in the wall with some really early dates. And that's it. Just that's it. And you're not going to find anything else unless you dig through that slumped in dirt. That's what I'm imagining, X-ray vision right through this hill. And it's right about there, 200 feet in. So.
Marvin and I had reconnoitered the site months before. We had learned that the entrance to the cave had been blown up in the 1960s by the Army Corps of Engineers, at the direction of the nuns that owned the property at the time. Since no obvious entrance could be found, I started to look for drill holes where the dynamite was inserted for blasting. It wasn't long before I found the telltale holes. We removed the rock that had been blown up decades ago.
Yeah, I can see.
Interesting mineral specimens were uncovered.
It's feldspar mica.
Yeah, I saw some biotite in there too.
That's it.
Over there?
That's mica.
Mica?
Mica
Yep.
is biotite is a species of mica.
Perfect.
So this is what they were looking
Is
for.
that,
That's it right there.
it's like kind of an amber color
This is muscovite.
muscovite.
I saw a big piece of muscovite on the ground there.
That's tough. I'm not, I mean, we can't see anything right now. I'm thinking every time we dug a little bit, I knew we were going to be able to dig a little farther. We weren't done yet, we weren't exhausted yet, and then we would get another hint, and we dig and dig, and then we didn't really find anything for a while, and then we'd find another hint, and then a void here and there.
By 1:30, an opening was finally revealed. Was this the entrance to the King's Ballroom?
It's hard to describe. It's opening up down there.
Still opening up?
Yeah, looks good.
I prepared to enter the cave. I set up a field monitor so that everyone could see what I see in real time.
So there's a passage this way too. So I think
So that part is all natural limestone. This part here looks like they just barred down the limestone.
Yeah.
There's a fissure between
Yeah.
it. They just barred it off the ceiling, broke it up, and sold it. That's what they did. It was probably all nice water carved limestone like we saw elsewhere, but they just barred it down. Didn't even have to blast it. So this is a natural water carved bowl that in the limestone that they just stacked the rocks on top of to make a support to gob up the rock to support the ceiling here, but they didn't think of the aesthetics of the cave when they did it. They just kind of stacked it on top of this beautiful water carved formation. I think there's more beyond that rock over there. Yeah, this is. Yeah, can you, here, I'll move home. Well, it definitely keeps going. I'm not gonna fit, but there's a bottom of a broken bottle down there. Obviously all this rubble wasn't in here when they were mining it.
Yep.
So it was probably like actually working height. Yeah, that definitely goes. It's a natural water carved cave. That water was flowing through underground, so it probably came in over there, and it carved channels all along this bed of limestone. And what it looks like the miners did to remove the limestone, since it's a water carved channel, it looks like they just sledgehammered off pieces of the cave and carted it out. There's no drill holes or anything, but also this whole section of limestone was removed. So there's no, you go from a section that's natural where it's too narrow for them to really fit reasonably, and then where it widens up, it's just completely removed. There's no limestone at all. So that's kind of how they made use of it. They found the channel, they just sledgehammered it off, carted it out, and it was like the easiest thing in the world for them to do. There's no drilling or blasting required. So, and there's no caves in this region at all. So, I mean, that's just from a geologic standpoint. It's definitely a success finding this thing. It's definitely a success to find a cave this far south. That's a water carved limestone cave. So, I mean, even though we didn't find the ballroom, which I still think is somewhere down there. There's channels, you could see how the water carved channels to escape, because the water's going in and it's finding its way out. So the water's actually carving these channels to find a way out. I don't know where it comes out. I mean, it keeps going this way. So, I mean, that might be an interesting thing to look for on a heavy storm. If there's a spring somewhere on the hillside that bubbles out water, that would be our exit. I then entered another small opening. Here, beautiful white and yellow limestone was dissolved by water, leaving this sharp, angular sculpture. At the bottom of the shaft, I can make out the top of a tunnel, almost completely filled with soil and loose rock. This rock was not limestone from the cave, and was either carried in by water or placed there by man. Was this the arched tunnel Plumb described that led to the king's ballroom? We may never know without more digging. We had in fact found a true limestone solution cave, completely unique in this part of Connecticut.
And we're just securing the hole now. We successfully got into the main location we wanted to. Didn't quite find a ballroom, but we found what the remnants of the mine, and that used to be a cave prior to that. And then we also dug a second section of a cave out, which had some very nice formations in it still. And we are just wrapping things up before we lose light. I think it was an absolutely full day here, and very successful. I think everyone's leaving very happy.
But the King's Ballroom had eluded us, just as it had Clay Perry decades ago.
You think the King's Ballroom will ever be uncovered?
With a larger machine, it could be. And you're gonna need a couple days, at least. Maybe some specialized machines with some straps to pull out some very large rocks. But it's a possibility. You'd have to get some large and small machines to get in there, to dig all the angles just to get in there. It'd be an undertaking. It's not impossible, but pretty difficult.
Maybe the King's Ballroom doesn't exist at all, and the story was purely hype to promote the cave. If it does exist, and is someday found, it would be one of the most fascinating speleological discoveries in Connecticut in the last 100 years. Until that day comes, the cave will continue to be a source of fascination and mystery, and maybe that alone will be its lasting legacy.